Good afternoon. My name's Marie Vanel. I'm the Head of Infrastructure for Asia Pacific for Societe Generale. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people listening in. I'd also like to thank the French-Australian Chamber of Commerce for the organisation of the event, Schneider Electric as the major sponsor, the French Embassy, Austrade, and the other sponsors of the event for their support throughout. I've worked with Societe Generale in a number of geographies, Europe, the US, and now in Sydney, always with a broad infrastructure remit, but a focus on transport. I'm delighted to be moderating the panel today, which has a wonderful lineup, and I thank you for your participation. Societe Generale is deeply committed to energy transition, and that manifests in many ways, including being one of the leading providers of financing to renewable energy through our energy business, EV battery manufacturing financing through our mining and metals business, and then through our infrastructure business in respect of, for example, mass transit and electric vehicle charging infrastructure, but also assisting companies and borrowers issuing green bonds and other sustainability-linked financing solutions. Today, I'm joined by 4 industry leaders in the field of sustainable transport, although each with quite a unique positioning and a unique perspective to bring to the discussion. They are Luca Gatti, CEO, Transdev Australasia; Mark Scott, CEO, Sistra, Australia and New Zealand; Greg Schumann, Director of Transport and Green Mobility at Engie; and Tim Washington, CEO of JetCharge. Please do make use of the opportunity to pose questions with the chat functionality, and also stay with us after the session for a live Q&A. There will be prompts following the end of this session. So to get started today, I'm going to ask each of the panellists to introduce themselves and address the question of what sustainability in transport means in your respective organisations. Mark, perhaps we start with you. Would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Marie. Look, if I may, I might just open up with a bit of background to Sistra and who we are and what we do, because I realise a lot of the audience may not know us. By background, we're French-owned, 85% by RATP and SNCF. So RATP being the administration that operates and maintains Paris Metro, the light rail and bus system, and SNCF being the national rail operator of France. So, key shareholders like that, then, as you might expect, we've worked a lot across the globe in key transportation projects. So we're actually one of the largest consultancies, 7,000 people, predominantly working in transport globally. And we cover everything from transport planning and design through to construction oversight, project management, but also, particularly with relevance to today, we also provide a lot of technological advice, and particularly advice around technology transition, supporting governments and operators worldwide. So very much so that the heritage of our business means that sustainability is in our DNA. And I mean sustainability in the broadest possible sense, sustainability of the industry as a whole, its workforce, the financial viability and sustainability of transport. But also environmental sustainability, which is really the area that I'm hoping to focus on the most today. Look, over many decades, we've supported environment and sustainability across the world. I mean, even before the greenhouse gas and carbon emission issues started to become very much a topic that was at the front of people's minds. The fact of the matter is that with modal shift for many decades been taking people from cars into rail, into metro, into light rail systems, which of course is now part of most countries and governments' sustainability strategy, being that modal shift. So it's something, as I say, it's really at the heart of what we've done for a long time. But in more recent years, as the magnitude of climate change has brought more urgency to finding new solutions to the problem, we've been tackling the problem in many other ways. So, for example, energy transition, we're supporting a lot of governments and operators at the moment to move more towards electromobility and other sources of fuel. So in Quebec, in Paris, in fact, in Orléans in France as well. We're heavily involved in projects at the moment to move towards electromobility. Each of those locations having targets to be fully electric, exception being Paris, which will also be biofuel, but all being electric by 2025. So some real short-term goals being set there. And then the other area we get involved in quite significantly at the moment, where we're seeing a big shift, is around eco-design as well. So we're putting a lot of investment into our projects to make sure we've got sustainable solutions, particularly on not just mobility, but also on major infrastructure projects, which they might leave a legacy for centuries, not just years and decades. And very important that we create sustainable solutions there. So two big key areas. I could go on and talk about others, but I'm probably taking up too much time, so I'll hand over to somebody else.
No, thanks, Mark, for the intro. Greg, what about at NG?
Yes, well, I suppose a lot of people know NG as the largest power provider, independent power provider in the world. But in the area of transport, I think NG's got I think an interesting perspective. Where around the globe we're involved in rail projects, very much in the systems piece, electrification of railway lines and things like that, and we're in a number of consortia and PPPs, etc., in that space. But we also, have entities that, in Europe we've delivered over 70,000 EV charging units. We own and operate, whole cities like Rotterdam, etc., where we run the whole network, and then we also, I think, interestingly, a few years ago we sold off our LNG business to Total, and invested in creating a hydrogen business unit. So we're one of these companies, I think, that isn't backing one particular technology. We're very committed to transport sustainability, and we're supporting, I think, all the areas in that piece.
No, thank you. Luke, at Transdev? You're on mute, Luke.
Thanks, Marie. Transdev is a global leader in public transport. Just to give you a bit of background, French-based, of course, its headquarters are in Paris. So 66% is owned by Caisse de Dépôt, which is a French financial institution, and the other 34% has been acquired a year or so ago by the Rethmann Group, which is a German multinational environmental group. So sustainability is at the core of both shareholders. Just to give you a brief background, Transdev operates in some 20 countries around the world, 80,000 staff, and is a true leader in mobility and bringing people and cities together. So our vision is to have, public transport remains to be the backbone of livable cities. And how do we connect people? How do we connect cities? Especially when you take into account the urbanization, densification, and let's not even go into the pollution aspects that all major cities face around the globe. So from our perspective, how do we take more and more cars off the road, and provide more efficient and sustainable public transport modes? And on top of that, how do we provide an excellent customer experience for our patronage? So that's our key focus. But sustainability is the common denominator. In Australia, for example, we operate the Sydney ferries, we operate buses, we operate all the light rail in New South Wales, we operate heavy rail in New Zealand. So we're quite right across Australasia with one major focus: transport and sustainability going forward. So with the new ferries that are coming on board in Sydney, they're all more efficient, more green. We've got e-buses that we've introduced in Queensland, New South Wales, and Victoria. And of course, the Sydney Light Rail, which is line 1, 2, and 3 in Sydney. So we're truly a sustainable group going forward, and the importance of public transport cannot be underestimated. And we're always looking at solutions, whether it's e-buses, whether it's hydrogen buses, mobility as a service, on-demand transport, shared services, shared transport services, all end up towards that sustainability piece. So that's just TransDev in a nutshell. What we do, we definitely partner with all the public transport authorities across all regions, and I guess we are here to serve the public and the PTAs. So we're clearly involved with all those aspects. Thank you.
Thanks, Luke. And then something of a pivot from the large French or international organisations to Tim at JetCharge.
Oh, thank you. That's a very
No
nice
less
one.
relevant, I should say.
That's very nice. I feel like a bit of an imposter. I was going to say we're the only ones who don't have a French shareholder, and I'm not French. But we have a lot of French clients, and so I feel like we can be French by osmosis a little bit.
Your contribution no less relevant to today's panel, Tim. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Very kind. So hi everyone, my name is Tim Washington. I'm the CEO of JetCharge. JetCharge is Australia's largest EV charging infrastructure deployment specialist, and we've deployed over 5,000 charging stations in Australia. We've been leading that space for the past 7 years. I'm also the co-founder and a director of ChargeFox, which is the largest EV charging network in Australia. And we're building, I guess, the first next generation petrol stations that are going from Brisbane to Adelaide, so you can drive on the major highways and fill up in under 15 minutes. And so when we first started that was the third network of its kind in the world. And I think if you want to talk about sustainability, I mean, it's pretty easy for us. The whole reason we exist is to help people transition to low emissions transport. So there is no other reason why we're around. And I think from a philosophical perspective, what we're trying to do is in two stages. We're first trying to show that the move to electric mobility involves no compromise. And I think infrastructure is essentially there to show that there is no compromise. The reason we're not concerned about range with our petrol and diesel vehicles is not because they have infinite range, but because we have very good infrastructure for fueling. Nobody knows the range of a Lamborghini Aventador. They'd probably be surprised to know that it's extremely small. But the reason that nobody cares about it is because they know they can go to a petrol station. So essentially, the move to low emissions mobility is really about infrastructure. It's not necessarily about the vehicles themselves. And so once we've kind of gone on to that stage and we've showed that there is no compromise, what we want to do next is to show that it's better. And again, that is to do with infrastructure, not just the vehicles themselves. So we want to be able to show that charging in your own home is easier and better. Being able to charge anywhere is better. So we're taking that two-stage approach, and that is how we approach sustainability for low emissions transport in Australia.
Great, thanks, Tim, for the intro, and a very diverse range of responses to that question, and I hope that gives those listening a sense of the breadth of this topic. To get started in terms of the panel, I wanted to touch on government procurement processes. It's something that I know each of you and each of your organisations participate in. And the question I would pose is, what progress have governments in the generic sense, but feel free to specify what level you're contemplating your response. But what progress has government procurement processes made, and what more work is there to be done in relation to developing sustainable transport and sustainable transport infrastructure? Who'd like to take that first? Greg, I know you're hot on the topic. Government procurement processes. You want to kick us off?
Yeah, look, I would say it's a bit of a work in progress. When you look at each state in that, there's many now that have signed up to zero emission by 2050. That's what they're aiming for. But if you take into the account that many buses, when you buy them, they'll last 20, 25 years. Probably the same can be said for trains and those sort of things. Then you start working back and you go, well, actually, this has to be the decade of change, substantial change. And I think government has a big sort of step in that, because I also see that as Tim said, you've got to have the infrastructure. So who's going to build the initial infrastructure? Companies like Engie and others, Jet Charge, are happy to do that, but it needs also government to align its procurement policies. More than just a 10% weighting or something in the assessment. That in this decade we're going to have to see tenders where internal combustion engine is no longer a valid reply in the supply of vehicles, trains, buses, government fleets, etc. So there is a way to go. Look, the conversations I've had, and I'm having many, it's starting to get some traction, but but it's a thing that needs to be driven from the top, because a procurement department won't make that change by themselves. So I suppose that's.
We are seeing some evidence, right? And jump in, guys, please. Luke.
Look, I thanks, Greg, and I agree. And it is a decade of change. It has started. We've certainly seen it in the public transport arena. Tenders now more and more across our region are looking for zero emission strategies, and we are helping governments and PTAs with that, like we all are. So the positive news is that it has started. And I think it will just continue. And no doubt, it needs total government support at the very highest of levels. And the weighting, of course, that's just been touched on, has to be quite significant, given the cost involved and the momentum of how quickly you want to succeed. Of course, buses, etc., last 20 odd years, so there's clearly a transition piece that has to happen. But overall, I've got to say, it has been a positive from the PTAs. It's been a long time coming. It's still not there, I don't think, but we need that driving force from up above. And organisations like ourselves are more than happy with our international experience to sit next to PTAs and help achieve the outcome.
And Marie, just if I may, just pick up on both of those points as well. I mean, look, I think we're definitely seeing momentum building behind electromobility and new sources of energy. I think that much is obvious globally, but also in Australia. The momentum's there, if it's not maybe obvious in tenders and contracts at the moment, but there is the build of momentum. I think there has been an overall shift of policy as well towards mass transit. We've seen that in Sydney in the last decade, particularly with Sydney Metro in the various stages of it, with light rail, So again, I think there's been a good shift there. Interestingly, just doing a bit of research prior to today, I wasn't aware, even though personally I was involved in the project, but Northwest Metro has offset 100% of its carbon offset, 100% of its electricity needs through operations. So, for me, I think that's a big step forward. But coming back to Greg's point, at the moment we don't really have any short-term objectives. Our objectives are around 2050 and net zero carbon greenhouse gas emissions. I mentioned Paris switching to 100% electric buses earlier on. The reason for that came about because there's been an immediate target set for the municipality, being a 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, by 2025. So, these are short-term targets that are then driving short-term procurement needs. So, I'd like to see that come into to Australia, those short-term targets personally.
I think maybe to pick up on Mark on that, we're starting to see on the ground some evidence of that happening, and certainly long-term targets are easy to announce and impossible to enforce. And so the people who do it well will announce a long-term target, but they have intermediary steps to demonstrate progress. One of those entities is the ACT government. So they have a pretty aggressive zero emissions policy, and part of that was transitioning their entire fleet to electric. This is passenger vehicles. They also made some announcements in relation to buses as part of the election, but passenger vehicles, and they have a goal to transition their entire passenger fleet where fit for purpose by 2025. It might be 2024 even. And as part of that, they've demonstrated that. I think we've certainly installed close to 100 charging stations for them in various ACT buildings. But all of that has been because they have announced a further out target. But they haven't done the lazy approach and said, well, the next government can figure that out. But they've actually kind of stepped it back. And it's directly affected procurement policy. So now when their fleet when their fleet managers go out to purchase vehicles, they actually don't have a choice. They must purchase electric where it's fit for purpose. And I think that has a significant impact. So you need to be able to measure against those long-term goals, but we must have these short-term goals, and we're hopefully starting to see some of that coming into the Australian market.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And what role does the private sector play in that sort of related question? What role does private sector play in that policy shift?
I think for me, it's always been about education. And so I never want the government to be sitting in a room among themselves with their department heads and say, we want to achieve this, but is the technology available to help us achieve it? Very simply, at a practical level, can these buildings take the amount of charging stations we need them to have to transition to low emissions transport? So from a private sector perspective, we need to be there to say, we're ready, the tech is ready, that it should not impact your policy goals. In fact, you should pull them forward. And certainly, as part of my role, the EV Council, that is all we do. We basically have, private entity kind of members, and we use that to inform government of all of the developments that are happening. And so, when they know that the technology is available to help them execute policy goals, it makes pulling forward policy goals or setting policy goals much easier. And so that's what I think the main role of private sector from our perspective is.
And others on that question?
I'd also like to add that, not only private, but countries now, I think, France is much further down the line of sustainability than unfortunately Australia is. And I know that, when we look at, we talk about EV charging or, for hydrogen, we're able to actually point to operating hydrogen, bus refueling, facilities in France, and garbage collection vehicles, and even train with Alstom, etc. So being able to not only say this is theoretically right, okay, but that we actually are already operating these things, that we've got lessons learned, and that we can bring that to Australia. I think that's a really important thing that we're well placed to do.
Yeah, and look, and I think there's a lot of solutions globally to a lot of sustainability problems. You can pretty much guarantee that whatever Australia is facing, somebody has faced it or is currently facing it. I think for me though, we do still need to define what the problem is, or rather, what our appetite for dealing with sustainability, Greg said, this decade actually is. And I think the solutions are there. It's a question of as I say, what's your appetite? What are you prepared to invest today to get the benefits of for tomorrow? Because there's no doubt, there is investment required, and it's that trade-off that I think government procurement agencies need to be empowered to consider and evaluate.
Yeah, look, we have, as everyone's touching on, we have all the global expertise that we can draw upon, but we do need the governments, etc., just to push that down to the procurement divisions, departments, and make sure that the investments are there as well, because it does come with a price, but it's a price one pays today for generations of the future.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. So I'm hearing sort of definition of the appetite to invest and then trickling that down, I guess, to effective short-term goals in terms of procurement of sustainable transport options. Greg, I think you already touched on an example from France in relation to what we're seeing there. Are there other examples from the international organisations in terms of bringing best practice to Australia in terms of some of this procurement? I'm sure that the audience would like to hear sort of a tangible example, if you have any, in relation to what we could transport, for want of a better expression, from the global experience, to Australia.
Well, if I can give you an example in terms of what Transdev does, they have at the moment over 800 e-buses around the globe, and 100 specifically in Amsterdam. And we as a group hosted Transport for New South Wales officials last year, and they actually came and had a look at what we do. So it's there, it's real. Overhead charging on the buses and depot charging. So I think they've all come back and taken that lesson, and now they're saying, well, gosh, we want this as well. Okay, that's great. That's step one. How do we get there? What's the investment? So I think it's, we can certainly bring global best practice, and we must be involved with these decisions at a very high level here in Australia. And that's just not operators like ourselves, but also infrastructure players as well. And it's got to be driven by the top, so that investment and you can actually see what you can provide. So there is very, very live examples of what all our organisations are doing globally. Hydrogen is another example. The list goes on and on. Transport on demand, shared mobility, etc., etc. It's the appetite, Marie. We've got to have the appetite.
Yeah. I think of it as in very much in line with what Luke said. I think of a project we did in Santiago, where we procured 100 e-buses. We built the infrastructure for charging it. We also supplied a green power purchase agreement over that piece as well. And the complexity there was that they actually wanted to be able to put those buses to a number of different operators, so that we became that sort of binding entity. But I think the really interesting piece in all of this is that, previously, what powered a city and what powered our transport, other than electric trains, what powered our transport were two different things. And with this energy transition, they're coming together. And so that ability to not just think of a bus that transports people, but it also a bus that is also a big battery on wheels. All of that comes into play, and it becomes more complex. But it also, I think, provide the opportunity for some really clever solutions comes into that as well.
And there's a parallel on that theme, Tim, with your business, right? In terms of I think you've referred to it as democratization of fueling. You want to touch on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and before I touch on that, like I do want to say that there is a price to incumbency. And what I mean by that is that Australia may be far behind, but we should use that to our advantage. There is definitely, like, the space is growing so fast and transitioning so fast, is that we need to learn from overseas examples. So it can't just be an aspirational thing where we look at overseas and go, well, they've done it, we need to do it. It needs to be, they've done it, how do we do it better? Then how do we continue to doing it better? And then how do we leapfrog them and lead by example? A classic example of that is obviously Tesla. They're not burdened down by incumbent internal combustion engine practices, and so therefore they're able to carve their own way. And much like that, because now we're seeing the price of incumbency, we need to ensure that we don't fall victim to that, but we also take advantage of our kind of behind the eight ball approach, which I think we can. Just on the, I guess what I would call the democratization of fueling, it's something that's actually being used by quite a lot of vehicle manufacturers when it comes to electric vehicles. And the idea behind that is that there are so many, we think of there being so many players in the internal combustion engine fueling supply chain, because you drive to local petrol stations, you're like, oh, there's so many brands of petrol stations. The reality, though, is that there is only a tiny handful compared to, how many companies there are. It's a tiny handful of companies that control the fueling ecosystem globally. And that comes from fuel extraction to transportation to refinery to retail downstream assets. And if you listed them all on a page, you'd be doing well. So I think that basically means that the competition that we think there is around fueling is actually non-existent compared to how much competition there is around electricity. And so, whereas you have to go to a petrol station to charge your to basically fuel your electric. I haven't gone to a petrol station for 6 years. I don't even know the terminology anymore. But whereas you have to go to a petrol station to fill up your car, you can charge your electric car anywhere there's electricity, and that brings with it an immense amount of competition, which is great for consumers, terrifying for incumbents, but ultimately everybody's going to move into that space and presents lots of opportunities. So the reason I call it democratization is because you, as an individual consumer, have all the tools you need. If you're allowed to, for example, put solar in your home, have all the tools you need to power your own transport 100% if you chose to. That has never been an option before. And then from there to a traditional kind of like centralized fueling petrol station model, there are a whole lot of things in between. But for the first time, we're able to take that into our own hands, which creates a whole lot of different opportunities for the private sector. And so I find that really, really interesting and exciting, because it means that all kinds of business models will come up. Then you take the next step, which is that your vehicle no longer is only for transportation, but is for energy. So you store the solar power in your vehicle and then discharge it into your home and workplace through bidirectional charging. That essentially means that you can use your vehicle as the storage and distribution device for electricity as opposed to anything else. And then that opens up across a whole lot of different things. And so when Greg refers to perhaps vehicles as being something that is going to power our cities, that is a future that we see, that apart from our electricity grid, vehicles will be the thing that also supplements that and in some cases replaces that, the movement of electrons from one place to another. That's a really exciting future that I think is not too far away.
It's a fascinating evolution and shift, whether it's around Mark, your comment on Northwest Metro and the completely offset energy requirements for that, but also these parallels between buses and private vehicles, effectively becoming a source of a source of energy. Um, Moving on, I want to talk about challenges. Well, I'd like you to talk about challenges. Some of the challenges we face, and Greg, we've talked about some of the challenges in relation to integration of these new solutions. As you see, the powering of cities. There's a lot of talk about the powering of cities and how that has shifted from a single coal mine to a much more diverse a much more diverse method. I'd like each of you to reflect on challenges, on the particular challenges posed for sustainability and transport in your own organisations, and how you see that. Greg, you look pensive, but perhaps someone else would like to go.
Okay.
No, that's fine. It's fine. I was just thinking what I should say. Look, I think for energy, the technology can't come fast enough. OEMs and that the vehicles, as Tim was saying, we see fantastic opportunity in V2G, so vehicle to grid, to be able to put bi-directional charging, and to have those vehicles. And we're not just talking about cars. We're talking about buses, trucks, whatever, that sort of piece. There's very few. I think a Nissan Leaf and not too many others that actually got bi-directional charging at the moment. Quite a number of buses do have that capability, but not all the charging infrastructure that you buy has that. We see this very much as a complete energy play, and having the technical ability. We're already trialing, sort of smart metering, V2G, etc., in different places, and the more that comes, one of Australia's biggest challenges is the renewables changing the curve. People have heard the term the duck curve and that, because solar is so much in the day, but the ability to absorb, to really flatten the curve of our demand, our supply peaks, etc. We also see hydrogen in that piece as well, because hydrogen has the ability to absorb electrons, store it, and use that in another piece. So, one of the complexity, there's I see it on LinkedIn. There's a furious debate between hydrogen and electric, and we certainly see them as complementary. It will be difficult with the existing infrastructure that we have in cities to be completely electric. The ability to store and be able to move those electrons is all that sort of piece. So yeah, look, I suppose
Look,
it's a good one.
yeah. Look, clearly there are a number of challenges, and I guess from my perspective, charging infrastructure is one which Australia has to face, and it has, but it's got some significant challenges ahead to get all these projects up and running. The other one which I'd like to touch on, or there's two more really. One is sustainable financing. Depending on your definition of what that means. At the end of the day, there is a cost, and how is that financed? If when we are talking about charging infrastructure. And the other one I'd like to touch on is from our other shareholder, where I came from, is waste to energy, because they are lighting up cities, as we all know, in Europe, just from waste to energy. And you can walk down Paris, you can walk in Berlin, and you'll see the stacks, and people just go about their business. And I think that's another massive challenge, because if you talk about waste energy in Australia, and I'm just digressing a little, it's foreign. It's almost like backyard burning. It's not. It's creating energy for future cities, and and sustainability, and providing heat, electricity, etc. And they are demonstrable things that our other shareholder, Rathman, which operates in 20 countries, can actually show. So I think there's charging infrastructure, financial sustainability, for want of a better word, and also there's waste to energy options that potentially could complement if you look at the livable cities of the future. So no one has all the answers, but again, it is actually happening in Europe.
No,
when you wrap the waste to energy, and then you actually look at the trucks, and they could either be electric or they could be fuel cell. Then you've and they're using the energy that those plants use.
Yes.
Then you've got a beautiful circular.
Circular economy, as they call it,
it's
and
fantastic. Very
it's still a little foreign here, I must say, but it's things that we can look towards and say, how can we do it better? And that was just quoted not long ago, and I think we have every single opportunity at our feet.
Yeah, and we are seeing it. WA are developing too.
Yes, waste energy.
There's a few moving around, but I think that's a growing area in that space. We got the idea that we just bury stuff.
Well, it's environmental, yeah. So
that's like we
anyway,
need another panel
food for thought.
I think we need another panel for that for
Another
sure.
panel for you two. I'm sure the chamber would be delighted to host another panel. But
Marie,
no, absolutely a broad range of challenges. But Tim, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say that the main challenge for us over the past few years, our first challenge was convincing EVs were a thing. That when back in 2013, when we were first getting started, that was our main challenge. And our main challenge now that people have acknowledged that low emissions vehicles are a thing is to convince people that past adoption and past performance is not an indication of future performance. So what I mean by that is they look at our adoption curve to date since 2013, 2014. They extrapolate that to 2025, 2027, 2030. And our job is to convince people that just because you only see a handful of Teslas on the road does not mean that that is the growth trajectory for the EV market. Because if you take a linear scale for EV adoption, obviously you've got a little bit of time to wait. But we're projecting 15 to 20-fold increase between now and 2025. To get organizations and government comfortable with that idea, let alone kind of companies comfortable with the idea that they will scale up that hard, is almost like too theoretical to talk about. Because most of the time when you're talking about that level of adoption curve, it's mostly to do with software, which is kind of easier. Candy Crush had no players one day and 10 million the next day. So that's okay because that's software. But when it comes to infrastructure, it's very, very different. And what we're going to see with EV charging infrastructure and EV adoption is that at the heart of that growth curve, it will grow harder than when the iPhone was first introduced as a consumer-friendly smartphone. That level of change we've only seen a few times in recent history at such a global scale. And I think we're not quite prepared for that, but we need to find better ways to convince people that that is coming, because only then will they take it seriously.
Very, very interesting perspective.
As I said, an interesting decade.
Mark, challenges as you see them, technical or
Look, no, I mean, look, there's definitely challenges, and I think we've touched on a number of issues there with infrastructure, and Tim was just talking about charge points. I mean, look, I think at the end of the day, when you're driving your own car, you can decide yourself as to whether or not you want to make a trip of a certain distance, dependent on the amount of charge your car has, I suppose. But if we look at the case of buses, for instance, and electric buses. I mean, one thing we found is, take your typical government procurement agency, transport procurement agency. They buy a diesel bus. Don't really have to worry about the fuel associated with that bus. They know that they can fill it up as they need. So things like bus timetabling are dependent on other things. But suddenly in the electric world, what we're finding is you've really got to think about the issues as a complete system. So the timetable that you're operating to needs to be looked at. The infrastructure needs to be looked at. So it's not like the old days where you would just procure a bus and the bus works. It's a case of really thinking about the system as a whole and changing your operations and your timetabling that's associated with that. So there's a bit of a shift in mentality, I think, that comes with the electric vehicle in that sense.
Yeah, thank you. Interesting additional context. One thing we haven't touched on COVID, which was deliberate. So I'm hoping that our listeners will be very pleased that we've managed to avoid that topic so far. But a little related in some way, I guess. The notion of mode shift, and I think as we've touched on, or a number of you have touched on, very substantial projects around mass transit in Sydney and of course other major cities, and certainly a desire to continue to grow that patronage, and particularly following unprecedented reduction in numbers post COVID. How respond to that, I guess, in a way that anyone would like to, but I'm interested in how that interacts with the discussion on EVs as well, and how the two fit together or contradict one another. Luke,
okay. Sorry, I can't help myself.
No, please.
COVID's a fascinating topic, and I can tell you we measure it at the moment in terms of patronage with our public transport authorities, and it varies from state to state, country to country, New Zealand, Australia. We're seeing some bus operations at 70%. We see our ferries in Sydney at a 35%, 40% patronage. Now, what we're seeing and what we think, it's going to take about a year, perhaps two, to come back to pre-COVID patronage levels. And there lies the dilemma, because that is so important to the public transport authorities, because it's all about, or not all about, but it has an impact on revenues. So we don't take a fare box risk, but obviously the PTAs do in general. Now, there's the contradiction. So we're looking for e-vehicles, e-buses, that's great, but we need to get those patronage numbers back up, because that's going to help the solution. And I think especially in this last, let me say, 9-10 months, where PTAs have, to commend them, they've kept public transport intact, there is a major cost to that they've incurred. And so, I'm not speaking for them, but I would imagine that they're not coming into January 21, financed properly, so to speak. So there are some of the contradictions. We definitely need to get patronage back. That's our big push at the moment, because there's more and more cars on the road, and you can see that it's increasing every day. I mean, because the message so far is don't get on public transport, which to me is wrong, and we have to change that philosophy, but it will take some time.
Yeah, and I think importantly there, Luke mentions, I think COVID's the issue. I don't think the development and growth of the EV market is particularly driving anything in this regard. Because I think at the end of the day, the vast majority of passengers choose to travel by metro or by rail because of convenience, and not not because it's cleaner or dirtier than any other system. That's probably going to maintain or probably going to be the main driver going forward. I suspect. I'd like to think we're going to be in a really good position going forward, and we have a number of modes of extremely sort of green modes of transport going forward. Cars can be green, and trains and buses can be green. I think that the options are looking really good going forward. I think, and then it just comes down to which mode of transport is more convenient.
Certainly.
I see this. While COVID itself has, obviously been a terrible thing, I think there's an opportunity, and where the opportunity is, especially for public transport, is one. The government's looking to spend money to get the economy going again. And what can make people think about and be attracted to public transport? Well, if that money is spent in helping further green, those methods of transport, electric buses, hydrogen buses, etc., and that to go with the electric trains and all that, then and you create a real story around that. Hopefully, that starts to be part of the parcel that attracts people back to public transport. And I think using government money, spending it on what we want the future to be, and not what it is currently, I think is money well spent.
I tend to agree with you, but it is a bit of a double-edged sword, I think. So we need the investment for the future, no question. And then on the flip side, we need to see how do we entice people back, and that's I think that's going to take a little bit of time. I mean, it is, and of course, the current the common denominator is the efficiency, and how do I get from A to B as quickly and as efficiently as possible. But I think there's two angles here. Clearly, the investment that's been announced, I think that's paramount. The other side is the confidence of the public coming back sooner rather than later.
Maybe Marie, if I offer a different perspective as well, and not just public transport, but what's really resulted from COVID is people spending more time at home. Certainly, I've been home for 7 months, and that has resulted, I think, in more engagement with your electricity provider, because all of our electricity price bills have gone up because we've been home the entire time. And generally speaking, when something goes up, like your bill goes up, you tend to pay more attention to it. And all of a sudden, the thing you've had on direct debit for the past 4 years, you don't even know who your electricity retailer is. You see more coming off your credit card and you go, hang on a second, am I with the right people? And once you start questioning who you're with, that becomes more interesting, because then you start looking at how much you pay per kilowatt hour, and perhaps because of what you've seen on the news in relation to climate change, where that power comes from. And I think because more people are in that situation now than they were pre-COVID, and it is a reflection of what happens when you purchase an electric vehicle as well. So the behavior that we're seeing at the moment, which is increased engagement with your electricity provider, is also what happens when someone gets an electric car, because their bill goes up. So throughout this COVID period, we've had a very big increase in basically people asking about solar charging stations, so things that charge specifically off solar, and bi-directional charging and when it's coming. And the people who expressed interest are pressing us harder for when the equipment will come into Australia. That's complete anecdata just from one organisation involved in this space. But I think a lot of it has to do with people being at home feeling like they should take more control over their electricity usage. And I think that'll be a reflection of things to come.
Yeah, great perspective. So I think it's time for us to wrap up, gents. It's been a fascinating chat, taking us to places I'm not sure I originally expected to, in terms of Candy Crush and waste to energy. So thank you for that. I think we've heard, just to sum up, if I may, we've discussed government processes, procurement processes. Clearly, some positive evolution there, but more work to be done, and certainly a very important role for the private sector, including each of your organisations, to play in that dialogue as procurement processes evolve and policies shift. We talked about some of the challenges from different perspectives in terms of the evolution of this space, but then also the final discussion around public transport versus but public transport and EVs. What I think the conclusion or the takeaway from that is, absolutely, complementary, and space for both of those things to develop positively in the context of, wholesale sustainable transport solutions. So Luke, Mark, Tim, Greg, thank you very much for your time today. For those listening in, we'll now, I understand there'll be a link for you to click on to have a live Q&A. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.